Welcome back now. Public Works and Infrastructure Minister Patricia De Lille has accused the Democratic Alliance of insinuating that government is responsible for spending almost R1 billion on the collective worth of properties occupied by ministers and their deputies in Cape Town and Pretoria. Now, in an open letter to the DA's Member of Parliament, Dr Leon Schreiber, De Lille says that the current government inherited this practice from the National Party. She also says that the response she gave to a parliamentary question about the value of official residences for ministers and deputy ministers is based on the current value, though many of the properties were actually acquired years ago and before 2019. A DA Member of Parliament and Shadow Minister of Public Service and Administration, Dr Leon Schreiber, joins us now for more on this. Dr Schreiber, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning. Always great to be here.
So let's first start with, what led you to ask that question to begin with?
Yes, so that's actually a great question in itself, because what the DA is busy working on is much broader than just this particular issue around houses, 97 houses that are worth about R1 billion at this time that ministers and deputy ministers are living in. We are busy, as we speak, quantifying for the very first time the actual cost to South African taxpayers of all ministerial perks, of the Ministerial handbook as it's known. And the housing element is one part of understanding the true cost of the Ministerial handbook, but you will know that there are other elements like luxury vehicles, VIP protection, which runs at about R8 million per person per year, the free water and electricity at these ministerial houses, staff component, massive staff component for each minister and deputy minister. So we are busy working on that. And we are doing so because for the very first time, we would like to show South Africans just how much the ANC cabinet actually costs us. And then we should compare that to the services that we are receiving.
So to be clear, this is not necessarily or per se about the residential properties, but about what is contained in terms of perks in the Ministerial handbook.
So those properties are one element and a very expensive element if you think about maintenance and everything else that goes into it of the Ministerial handbook. So the question is indeed broader than that. But I think one thing that is worth highlighting from what Minister De Lille has said, and something that I really find quite difficult to process, to be honest with you, is this argument that this is something that the pre-1994 government did, as she puts it, and therefore somehow it's justifiable today, 30 years into our constitutional democracy. I think the problem with that argument is, of course, that what we live in now is supposed to be a system with highest moral standards than what came before 1994. And when we look around us at the poverty that so many people are living in, the stage 6 load shedding that we're experiencing, the economic decline all around us, I do believe it is fair to ask whether the entire cabinet, not the president and heads of governments, but the entire cabinet, including deputy ministers, should be living like rock stars at taxpayer expense.
And I'm glad you raised the response by Minister De Lille, because for one, she says that these properties, many of them were acquired before 2019 and were inherited, such as the Grooteskuur estate in Cape Town and the Provincial estate in Pretoria. She says these residences were actually inherited from the apartheid government. So with that point made, does that make a difference to the argument that you are trying to advance?
I don't believe so. And I think it's important to distinguish here between what really is, I think, standard practice around the world, which is that the head of a government often has a kind of heritage site that the president, for example, just think about the White House in the US, or governors in America, for example. The heads of government often have these estates that in many cases are open to the public. But what we are talking about here is 97 houses, mansions, according to Minister De Lille, each of which are on average valued at about R10 million. And each of these ministers and deputy ministers get 2 of these. And so that's what brings you to the figure of almost R1 billion. I don't think it makes I don't think it's an acceptable excuse to say that because apartheid did something, we must do the same now. The question is, what has this government done in the intervening 30 years since such a system was inherited? And also, as I say, the system we are living under today is supposed to have far superior moral standards to the one before 1994. I don't understand why she's using that as her measurement of what is moral and what is just. And even beside that, the question is, in South Africa today, with everything going on around us, should our ministers live like rock stars? Are they delivering services to the people of the country that justify this? And if the answer is no, as I believe it is, then the government must urgently intervene, because what they are creating here is a system of insiders and outsiders. They've created this elite in the ANC, a group of elite cadres who don't pay for housing, who don't pay for water, who don't pay for electricity, who don't pay for security, who don't pay for vehicles, who don't pay for flights, who have 15 staff members in some cases, costing millions every single year. It is no wonder that this cabinet cannot fix the problems in South Africa, because they don't experience the problems in South Africa.
I remember having this conversation at several intervals with different analysts looking at the Ministerial handbook and looking at these perks, but it seems to have gone on. Minister De Lille argues that the provision of residences and some of the other perks, for example, may be as part of tools of trade for members of the executive, as outlined in the guide for members of the executive. But of course, I'm assuming that your argument now is a principal one in terms of what is being spent on the executive. But what about provincial MECs, premiers? What about them? Do they also get to be included in this? Do they also live in government-provided accommodation? How does it work?
Yes, so as far as the provinces are concerned, the head of that government usually does have some kind of public residence. That's again, usually something that's a heritage site or open to the public. And as far as my knowledge goes, when it comes to provincial cabinets, they don't have these houses. So this is something that is at the national level, these mansions for ministers and deputy ministers. But I think your question touches on the most important point here, and that is the systemic nature of the problem. And as you say, over many, many years, we've spoken about the Ministerial handbook. The DA, in many cases, has exposed some of the abuses in this instrument. But what we are dealing with now, and the campaign that we are focusing on now, is to actually question the Ministerial handbook in its entirety. Our research has indicated that the handbook is not based in any law, and therefore the existence of this instrument may in itself be illegal. That is something that we've referred to the public protector. We've asked the public protector to confirm whether it is in fact the case that no law provides or empowers the president to simply, at the stroke of a pen, introduce more expenditure for taxpayers to fund these perks. The second part of this is that we are introducing a piece of legislation in Parliament that would actually amend the Remuneration of Public Office Bearers Act to say that when there are tools of trade or something that is justifiable, those things must be brought to Parliament. There must be parliamentary oversight. There must be accountability, because what we are seeing now is a handbook that, in the case of last year, for example, can be secretly amended by the president with something that can cost South African taxpayers billions without them even knowing about it. That is not acceptable in a constitutional democracy. It must come to Parliament. Parliament must play its proper oversight and accountability role so that we can prevent a situation where every few months there's a new scandal out of the Ministerial handbook.
And I think most South Africans would agree with you on that particular score. I must ask you, though, the Premier of the Western Cape, does he live in his own residence or does he live in one that is provided for by government?
Now, again, I think when it comes to the premiers, they are the heads of government in the provinces. So my understanding is that the Western Cape Premier does live on a heritage site. It's an estate called Leeuwenhof, which is open to the public. There are museums on the premises. and it is actually a heritage site dating back a couple of hundred years, as far as I'm aware. So this again is something like you see around the world: the head of government living in a site that is a heritage site that's open to the public. But as I said, the provincial cabinet, so the MECs or ministers, as they're called in the Western Cape, do not have these kind of luxurious mansions that we see at national level.
I think I know. I think you know the point I'm trying to drive at here, Dr. Schreiber. If it's going to be something that we're going to balk against, then we've got to balk against it in its entirety as a matter of principle. So, it doesn't matter that the Premier lives in a heritage site. The fact of the matter is government still pays for it. So, therefore, if the Democratic Alliance, and this is the question I'm moving to now, is going to make this sort of assertion and say that, we need to look at these perks, we need to maybe not have government officials and members of the executive, by extension, live in these luxurious accommodation pads, one in Pretoria, one in Cape Town, and the taxpayer has to pay for it, then we need to look at everything that comes with that, including what happens with the premiers, because effectively they have similar sort of perks accrued to them.
Well, in the case of the Western Cape, what I can say is that the set of rules around this, first of all, is based in the Western Cape Constitution, and secondly, is far less generous than what we see at national level. And I agree with the principal point that you are making. I think the question we need to ask as we review this is, are we now also going to say that the head of government, so for example, the president, should not have an official residence as he does in Pretoria? Again, I think that when it comes to the head of government, these are often heritage and symbolic sites. So I think that there may be something slightly different there also in the case of the president. But what we need to look at is the entirety of the package. Is it rooted in law? And is it justifiable that not just the president or head of a particular government, as the case may be in a province, but really, in this case, almost 100 other properties and all the staff that comes with that for other members of the executive, is that justifiable under current circumstances? So we need to be reasonable, and that is what Parliament's role is. That is why it is so important to bring this matter to Parliament to reform the legal system so that the Ministerial Handbook is subject to parliamentary oversight and not something that can just be changed on a whim. And then all of these issues can be ventilated. And I'm confident if that happens, we will be able to prevent situations like we saw last year, where at the stroke of a pen, ministers suddenly received unlimited amounts of free water and electricity. Those are things that should not happen in secret.
Well, I totally agree with you. And as I said, we've had these discussions in terms of just how luxuriously our ministers do live. But by extension, I would like to see the perks that accrue to premiers, to MECs, to every single government official at every single level actually be looked at. And this is the point I'm driving at. It shouldn't matter that Premier Alan Winde is the premier of a province as opposed to what's happening with the minister. If those perks are for some reason viewed to be basically, what's the word I'm looking for? If they are outrageously luxurious for no good reason, then we should be opposed to that. And I think that should go for the premiers as well, because I feel that it's a bit of a double standard if you say that it's okay for us to look at what the ministers are earning, but the premiers, we should leave them, because they performing a different type of function. Why should they be left out of this?
Well, you can ask the same question about the president then. I assume you're not suggesting that the president should also be not have access to Mahamba and Lopfo where he does stay. So what I'm suggesting is my view about the heads of government being something that is accepted practice around the world. But once again, I think the important point is this. If we want to seriously review this system in its entirety and we want to look at different parts of it, then why is it not going to Parliament? If there are differing views on this, and if I've heard Minister De Lille say on other interviews that she wants to look at this system as well, then really, why is it not subject to parliamentary oversight? That is the forum to have this discussion. And I think that if we can fix the system, then we will address everything all the way from the president through down into the provinces, and we'll be able to say, this is what Parliament considered in an open and transparent way to be reasonable tools of trade, to be reasonable as, for example, the presidential house in Pretoria, something that goes with the status of the office. But these other things, which are now costing billions of rands in some cases, is something that is not justifiable. That is something that we can achieve, but it can only happen if Parliament plays its proper oversight role over all of this.
And that is totally agreeable, I would imagine, to many a South African, feeling that we shouldn't be spending as much on some of these things, because the reality is sometimes you find yourself in a situation where someone enters and they're an MEC of something somewhere. You don't even recognize the person. The only thing that alerts you to the fact that they are someone important is the detail around them. So the question has to be asked, do we really need that, those perks that accrue? Do we need the security detail and all of the other perks that go with it? But I think, as you say, we need to ask the question as well, should the president also be included in that? But if we're going to talk about the ministers, then we have to talk about the premiers and the MECs and everybody else. But we have to leave it there, Dr. Schreiber. It's an interesting discussion, and hopefully our viewers will weigh in on it as well at Morning Live SABC. Let us know what your thoughts are. But thanks so much, Dr. Leon Schreiber, DA Member of Parliament and Shadow Minister of Public Service and Administration, discussing the value of the ministerial residences and the handbook more extensively, because they have asked the public protector to look into this particular matter. What are your thoughts? Do you think that our executive have too many perks that accrue to them? And let us know what you think should be done differently at Morning Live SABC.